But some of us may have already realized that the reproduction of racism in the society cannot be solely attributed to one social institution. Some of us may have observed the racial disparity in education, in income, in wealth, in other types of resources, and we realize that it is not a story about one single social institution. And indeed, this is why many scholars come up with the term of structural racism. They realize the limitation associated with the term institutional racism. Institutional racism as a term seems to be implicitly assuming that racism is only occurring in one isolated social institution. But we realize that this is not the case. Different social institutions collaborate together with each other, reproducing racial inequality and racism in our society. So scholars come up with the term structural racism. According to our textbook, structural racism is defined as the interinstitutional interaction across time and space that reproduce racial inequality. So what can be the examples of structural racism? I will give you an hypothetical example here, but it is indeed a very common example that we may observe almost on a daily basis. So for instance, two important social institutions, education and workplace, usually collaborate with each other, reproducing racial inequality. How does it happen? We have already observed the existence of institutional racism in education, and we have observed the existence of racial disparity in terms of students' achievement score. Supposing that in the workplace, meritocracy is still the institutional norm in the workplace, and we know that an important outcome associated with education is the outcome in the job market. So students want to find a job after graduation. Supposing that the employers also select students guided by the norm of meritocracy. So this means that they will select students according to the so-called achievement score that they see on students' transcript. We saw that racial disparity existed in achievement score in education. If employers select students only based on achievement score, this racial disparity will be transformed from educational disparity to the disparity in the job market. So in other words, racism is reinforced because of the collaboration of these two important social institutions, education and the workplace. If we want to identify the mechanism that's reproducing racial racism in our society, it is not just a story about what is happening in the workplace. It is not just a story about what is happening in education. It is a story about collaboration between education and the workplace. So we say that it is a manifestation of structural racism instead of institutional racism. So we have already observed the differences between structural racism and institutional racism. But in fact, a group of scholars raised this argument that structural racism by itself does not really provide us with a comprehensive picture about the reproduction of racial inequality and the reinforcement of racism. And in particular, structural racism ignored the existence of historical roots in the reproduction of racism. And indeed, I personally, from my scholarly perspective, agree with this critique to structural racism. This is because even within the brief introduction of the historical events that construct racism and construct the concept of race in this course, we have already observed that historical roots have profound implications to what we have observed in terms of racism in our current society. Therefore, a group of scholars raised the argument of systematic racism. They define systematic racism as a diverse assortment of racist practices encompassing daily microaggression, deep-seated inequality, and anti-Black ideologies. And they believe that the daily microaggression, deep-seated inequality, and anti-Black ideologies cannot be only attributed to what we are reproducing in terms of the racial inequality in our current societies. Instead, they need to be traced back to what we have observed in the history of anti-Blackness in the United States and even in other racialized countries. So this is why they want to come up with the term of systematic racism to really highlight the part that is ignored or downplayed in the term of structural racism, which is the importance of history. Of course, in the scholarly communities, there are still a lot of ongoing discussions on in what scenario we need to utilize institutional racism versus structural racism, or in what scenarios we need to utilize structural racism versus systematic racism. Because you're all junior scholars interested in the social scientific understanding in race and ethnicity, I will leave it an open-ended question to you to decide how we need to rely on different terms in order to most accurately describe the root of racism in our society. But before I leave it as a question to you on the discussion board, we really need to have a deeper understanding on how race is formulated. So to understand the formation of race, we need to go into the racial formation theory. I will see you in the next video.